Ancient Roman texts written about a decimated army. Tage. Beyond it, the destiny. The cultural transformation. 2,200 against 70,000. In military history, those numbers do not describe a battle. They describe an execution. When armies grow that large, resistance usually collapses before the fighting even begins. Commanders retreat. Cities surrender. Survival becomes the only rational goal. And yet, in this case, 1,200 elite soldiers did not retreat. They did not surrender. They stood their ground, and what followed shocked the world. At first glance, the outcome should have been obvious. 70,000 soldiers represent overwhelming force, endless reserves, and absolute confidence. Against them, 1,200 men should have been erased in hours, their stand remembered only as a tragic footnote. History has seen this imbalance countless times, and the result is almost always the same. But this time, history hesitated. What makes this confrontation so disturbing is not just the numbers, but the reaction that followed. This was not a minor delay or symbolic resistance. It was an event that forced observers, enemies, and historians alike to stop and ask a dangerous question. How did an elite force so small disrupt an army so vast? The answer was not luck. It was not miracle. It was preparation colliding with arrogance, discipline colliding with mass, and a refusal to accept that numbers alone decide fate. The battlefield became a place where assumptions collapsed and certainty turned fragile. For the 1,200, this was never about glory. They understood exactly what they were facing. They saw the scale of the enemy. They knew reinforcements were unlikely. They knew that survival was uncertain at best. But they also understood something their enemy did not, that elite soldiers are not defined by how many they are, but by how they fight when escape is no longer an option. The larger army marched forward believing victory was guaranteed. They had crushed opposition before. Their reputation traveled faster than their banners. Fear usually cleared the path ahead.
The fate of Tage rested on that day. Beyond it, the texts of many cultures, their descendants, and all that history could build.
The battlefield that would soon host the clash between 1,200 and 70,000 existed within this logic. Strategically, it mattered. Symbolically, it was dangerous. Allowing resistance to hold here would challenge the narrative of inevitability. It would suggest that power had limits, and that suggestion alone was threatening. For the elite soldiers who would stand there, the world offered no safe alternatives. Retreat would only delay annihilation. Surrender would erase everything they were trained to protect. To fight was not heroic. It was the last remaining form of control. They understood that if this stand failed, the consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield. This was a world primed for shock. A world that believed it understood how war worked. That numbers decided outcomes. That discipline could not outweigh scale. When assumptions harden into certainty, even a single disruption can cause cracks to spread. As both armies moved toward one another, neither believed they were about to rewrite anything. One expected to conquer, the other expected to endure. What neither anticipated was that the collision of those expectations would produce something history would struggle to explain. A moment when total war met total resistance, and certainty began to fracture.
The army of 70,000 did not see itself as an invading force struggling for survival. It saw itself as history in motion. This was a war machine built on numbers, momentum, and an unbroken record of success. Its strength was not just measured in soldiers, but in reputation. Wherever it marched, resistance collapsed long before the first engagement. Fear had become its most reliable weapon. 70,000 soldiers meant depth without limit. Infantry formed massive blocks that could absorb losses without slowing. Archers and ranged units followed in overwhelming numbers, capable of saturating entire fields with fire. Cavalry waited on the flanks, ready to exploit any weakness, any hesitation. Even if the front lines fell, replacements were always ready. Exhaustion was a problem for smaller forces, not for an army like this. Supply lines reinforced that confidence. This was not a force racing against time. Food, weapons, and reinforcements moved steadily behind it, ensuring that pressure could be applied endlessly. Where defenders counted arrows and rationed strength, this army consumed freely. Time favored the larger force. It always had. Past victories fed the belief that nothing could stop them. Smaller armies had tried. Cities had resisted. None had lasted long. Each success reinforced the idea that scale alone decided outcomes. Strategy became secondary, precision unnecessary. Why adapt when overwhelming force had never failed? Commanders planned accordingly. The expectation was not whether they would win, but how quickly. Resistance was viewed as an inconvenience, not a threat. The idea that 1,200 soldiers could disrupt their advance was unthinkable. Calculations reduced the enemy to numbers on a map, easily erased by mass. Psychologically, this confidence ran deep. Soldiers marched believing they were untouchable. That belief mattered. Confidence keeps formations tight, orders obeyed, and fear suppressed. Against most enemies, it was enough to ensure
the catastrophic deaths of Kari. Beyond it, the fragments of the ancient world melted. And so, the destiny of Rome changed. The death of a Roman general at Carrhae was buried into texts. Beyond it, catastrophic fragments of an altered destiny. 2 decades after the battle, a Romanian Jordan is found in Democrat. He allegedly belonged to a single family that wiped a Roman legion out. This family belonged to a custom that breeds ultra-elite warriors. It was the descendants of a crusader that held this secret. A secret guarded from passage to future generations. The key to control.
Section 5. The calm before impact.
The hours before the clash unfolded in an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles only when everyone understands that what comes next cannot be avoided. Among the 1,200 elite soldiers, there was no rush, no frantic energy. Preparation moved at a steady pace, deliberate and controlled. Armor was adjusted. Weapons were inspected. Positions were taken and retaken, not out of doubt, but out of discipline. This was not the calm of confidence in victory. It was the calm of acceptance. Every man knew the size of the force advancing toward them. 70,000 was not an abstract number. It was visible in the distance, stretching across the land in endless ranks. The sight alone should have broken resolve. Instead, it sharpened focus. When reality is fully acknowledged, there is no room left for illusion. Some spoke quietly, not about the battle, but about routine things, familiar memories, ordinary moments. These conversations were not attempts to escape fear, but ways to ground themselves in something real before chaos erased everything else. Others remained silent, eyes fixed on the terrain ahead, mentally rehearsing movements they had practiced hundreds of times before. Fear existed, but it was contained. Elite training had taught them that fear ignored becomes panic, but fear understood becomes control. Breathing slowed, muscles loosened, minds narrowed their focus to what mattered immediately: where to stand, when to move, who to watch. Everything else faded. Commanders moved along the line, offering final instructions in calm, measured tones. There were no speeches meant to inspire false hope, no dramatic words about honor or glory. Orders were simple and precise. Hold this ground, maintain formation, do not pursue. These instructions were not motivational, they were survival. The environment itself seemed to reflect the tension. The air felt heavy, sounds carried farther than they should have. Even the ground beneath their feet felt charged, as if it sensed.
The Battle of Carrhae tore from one side to the other. Beyond it, destiny was written in the fragments of empire. These texts are our descendants, and we are their ancestors. The tales of this Battle of Carrhae echoed across the ages. The fate of many depended on that single day. Beyond it, the answers lay in an ancient text. The fragments revealed the destiny of what lay before. It showed cultures and civilizations transformed. The consequences were profound. The descendants of that day acted bizarrely.
Praetorius Carrhae. Beyond it, the ancient texts document the catastrophic defeat of the Roman legions. Savagely butchered, only a small fragment of survivors made it back to Honoria. The descendants of the survivors still live in Europe today, in separate pockets close to the Roman border.
What halted an army of 70,000 was not a single tactic or moment of brilliance. It was the accumulation of small, disciplined decisions executed without hesitation. The elite force did not try to defeat the larger army outright. They denied it the conditions it needed to function. And in war, denying conditions can be more powerful than winning battles. The first factor was terrain. The elite soldiers positioned themselves where numbers could not be fully applied. Narrow approaches, uneven ground, and limited angles of attack forced the larger army into compression. Only a fraction of its soldiers could engage at any given time. The rest became pressure rather than power, pushing forward without space to fight effectively. What should have been an advantage became an obstacle. Formation amplified this restriction. The elite maintained tight, overlapping formations designed to absorb impact and control space. Shields were not just defensive tools, they were anchors. Weapons struck from behind layers of protection, minimizing exposure while maximizing efficiency. This structure allowed the elite to survive repeated assaults that would have shattered looser formations. Rotation was equally critical. Exhaustion is the silent killer of discipline, and the elite managed it carefully. Fighters on the front line were pulled back the moment fatigue threatened control. Fresh soldiers stepped forward, not rested, but capable. These transitions were fast, practiced, and dangerous, yet they preserved cohesion. The larger army relied on constant pressure instead, assuming numbers would compensate for fatigue. Over time, that assumption failed. Psychology played a decisive role. The elite force fought with controlled silence. There were no victory cries, no visible fear. This unsettled attackers accustomed to enemies breaking under noise and intimidation.
Each failed assault planted doubt. Each delay raised questions. Fear does not spread instantly. It moves quietly.
The incursion of Carrhae. Beyond it, the sea stands. Where death stirs, bones raise. The Roman fate was seated upon a yet unknown destiny, and its lands waited for a cataclysmic shift. Years passed, the texts grew, and some fragments endured long enough to reach our days. Not all those descended from Rome received those texts. Some cast them aside. Some lost them. Some destroyed them. But others preserved them. Some copied them. Some added to them. Some even translated them. Those who preserved them gave knowledge to us.
Centuries after Carrhae, the echoes of that blow continued to resonate. Beyond it, the origins of the empire were dense, with mystery and destiny.
The pageant of Carrhae spread across the world. Beyond it, the death was catastrophic. The fragments spilled over centuries. In the darkest days, the legacy survived. The texts returned. The descendants rebuilt. This was the pageant of Carrhae. The outcome was no longer guaranteed.
The battlefield did not resemble a place of victory or defeat. It resembled a warning. Bodies lay scattered where momentum had failed. Weapons were abandoned where strength ran out. The army of 70,000 began to pull back, not in full retreat, but in disbelief. What was supposed to be inevitable had stalled. For the elite soldiers who remained standing, there was no celebration. Survival came with a heavy cost. They looked around and saw what endurance demanded: fallen comrades, shattered formations, and exhaustion etched into every face. Victory, if it could be called that, felt incomplete. They had not destroyed their enemy. They had exposed its limits. News of the outcome traveled faster than the armies themselves. Observers, allies, and rivals struggled to understand what had happened. An elite force of 1,200 had not been erased. It had held against 70,000. That fact alone unsettled established assumptions about power and warfare. Confidence began to shift in places far removed from the battlefield. For the larger army, the impact was immediate and damaging. Its reputation, once built on inevitability, now carried doubt. Other powers took notice. Resistance that had once seemed pointless now appeared possible. Strategic calculations changed. Expansion slowed. Commanders became cautious where they had once been aggressive. The psychological advantage that had preceded this army was gone. Politically, the shock was just as significant. Leaders who had relied on sheer numbers to project dominance faced uncomfortable questions. How could such a force be delayed, bloodied, and forced to reconsider? The answer was not flattering. It suggested vulnerability, and vulnerability invites challenge. For those who witnessed the battle, the memory lingered long after the blood dried. The image of an elite line refusing to collapse against overwhelming odds became a reference.
The expected order of things cracked, and no one could ignore it. The shock did not come from total victory. It came from survival against logic. History often remembers decisive wins and catastrophic losses. This event fit neither category cleanly. That is why its impact was so deep. It forced a re-evaluation of what power truly meant, and how easily it could be challenged under the right conditions. The world did not change overnight, but something fundamental shifted.
The idea that overwhelming force alone could guarantee obedience had been damaged, and once that idea was questioned, it could never fully recover.
The shock did not come from a decisive victory parade or the total destruction of an army. It came from something far more unsettling. An elite force of 1,200 had faced 70,000 and refused to disappear. That refusal disrupted the logic that had governed warfare for generations. Numbers were supposed to decide outcomes. Scale was supposed to guarantee obedience. This battle proved that belief dangerously incomplete. History prefers clean conclusions, clear winners, clear losers. This event offered neither. The larger army was not annihilated, but it was exposed. The smaller force did not conquer, but it survived in a way that changed perception. Such outcomes are difficult to frame, difficult to celebrate, and difficult to explain without challenging existing power structures. For those in power, this battle was uncomfortable. It suggested that control was more fragile than advertised, that discipline could outweigh scale under the right conditions, that elite training, leadership, and terrain could disrupt even the most overwhelming force. These were not lessons empires wanted to emphasize. They invited resistance. As time passed, the story began to fade at the edges, reduced to statistics, softened in retellings, sometimes omitted entirely, not because it lacked significance, but because it carried the wrong message, that even the strongest armies have limits, that certainty can be broken, that dominance is not absolute. For the soldiers who stood there, memory was heavy. Survival brought pride, but also loss. Many never spoke of it openly. Others carried the experience quietly, knowing that what they had endured could not be fully understood by those who were not there. Their victory was not one that restored strength. It consumed it. And yet, the story endured, because it contradicted expectation, because it forced anyone who heard it to pause and reconsider assumptions, because it proved that war is not governed solely by mathematics. It is
The ancient conflict of Kare continues to resonate. Decades passed. Beyond it, the ancient texts remain. They cast a long shadow over the fragments of culture. The descendants of those terrors continue to navigate the ancient scraps,